And now, it's The Law Show on CL 650. A comprehensive look at everything you need to know about the law.
Can I get a witness? Can I get a witness? Can I get a witness?
Hey, and welcome to the show on CL 650. It's The Law Show. I'm Zach Spencer, and we're joined by our two lawyers from MKS Law in downtown Vancouver, Rudy Kisher and Alex Stojkovic. They are immigration and citizenship lawyers, and I have one question to ask you. Are you busy?
Oh, yeah.
And 2 words, executive order. This is the Donald Trump, or President Trump now, signed just soon after he came into office, the executive order to ban people coming from several countries in the Middle East, and it's thrown sort of a cat amongst the pigeons. Would that be safe to say?
I think so. I don't think anybody, I mean, he's trying to do what he said he was going to do, but I don't think anybody saw it coming this quickly or saw it coming this way. And it definitely caught everybody off guard, and including a lot of our clients, actually.
So, Alex, why don't you run through what this executive order is and how quickly it was put together and now it's held up in court. So explain what they did, how it wasn't effective, and where we're kind of at now.
Well, essentially what the ban has done is it's banned nationals from 7 specific countries. Some are Middle Eastern, others are African or North African, from entering the United States for 90 days, regardless of whether or not they've had visas issued to them. So this could be someone who has had a multiple entry visa already at the time that this order was issued in January. For 90 days, those citizens of those countries cannot apply for visas, and citizens of those countries, if they've been issued visas, cannot use them.
So you have a mom and a dad who's coming from Iran to visit their grandkids in California, for example.
Right.
And they have gone through the process and been issued visas from the United States. So they're being okayed to go up until the date that the executive order was written. Then all of a sudden they can't come.
Correct.
Is that basically
That's a 90-day block on them coming.
So they're showing up at the airport, and the airport, because
the
of
airline
the
is saying no thanks.
we're not going to take
We
you.
can't let you on the plane.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's what's going on. Now,
So this was rushed from everything I've heard in the news.
yes, and the open questions as a result of this. Now, a little bit of background on it first. So it's important to note that these were all countries where there were some special measures before, and several of these countries are countries that really are in a state of social disorder at the moment.
Failed states, pretty much.
Essentially failed states. You have 3 failed states in particular. You have Somalia, which is essentially hasn't had a functioning state since the early 90s. You have Libya, which has fallen apart in the last several years and which is run by rival factions, including a large chunk of Libya is run by an al-Qaeda affiliate. You have Syria, which has been under probably the most horrific civil war of recent times over the last 4 years. So that's 3 of them. In addition to that, you have Yemen, which is also a country where there's an al-Qaeda affiliate running part of the country, and the rest is subsumed in another horrific civil war. And finally, the Sudan, where you do have a functioning state per se, but the state's control over the entire country is limited because of, if people remember, the crisis in Darfur, which is continuing, and war on the southern border with the country next to it, which is South Sudan, which also has a civil war on. So to some extent, these are all 7 countries, with the exception of Iran, and where there was already some element of civil war on.
And sanctions.
And sanctions, yes.
Until the agreement was reached. So what has been brought up is Obama had this list as well, and you said there were previous measures. What happened in the past?
Well, there were special vetting measures for security background checks. What people are referring to as extreme vetting. Trump has made it sound like this is the first time this has ever happened. They were doing that already for these 7. And the feeling was for 6 of these 7 countries, this was necessary for the reason that the people involved needed to be carefully scrutinized because there were the presence of al-Qaeda and other al-Shabaab, for example, in Somalia. You had to be very careful for terrorist links. And in the Iranian case, there was the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, which is probably the most powerful institution in Iran, and who has a web of business interests around the world, including through shell companies, even assets in North America. that the Obama administration, much like the Bush administration before it, was very concerned with its funds being used to finance Iran's adventures abroad, if you will. I mean,
a lot of links they're claiming between the Syrian conflict and the money coming from Iran.
The government in Syria is largely backed by Iran, as is Hezbollah in Lebanon, as are the Houthis in Yemen. So, there were some legitimate reasons for taking extra care with reviewing background checks. What's unprecedented, though, by this order is the idea that you're just going to blanket not accept anyone from these countries. We've never, the United States traditionally doesn't do that.
They did it. They did it for Iran in the 1980s. They definitely did it for Iran.
Well,
that's a long
after
time
the
ago.
refugee.
It's been a long time. Yeah,
not the refugee,
the hostage taking.
Hostage taking. Yeah. So that's what started, right? And
Yes.
And then what followed is that all of a sudden these people show up at the airport. They can't get on planes. They're going to, and some of them are elderly people going to visit grandkids. Some of them are business people. You got a wide swath of the populace that's trying to travel. There was
the chaos was substantial. First, the order itself. I think I'm not speaking out of turn here if I say that they rolled it out in an amateurish fashion. They didn't brief their own staff internationally as to how that this was going to come into effect. They also didn't brief properly their own Customs and Border Patrol people. And it also seems like they didn't think through who this would affect or not. Mm-hmm. So, for example, the question that we got in the first few days, does this apply to green card holders? Does this apply to dual citizens? What if you're Canadian and Iranian?
And there's a lot of Iranian people in the Lower Mainland.
Of course there are. And does that mean none of them can go to the United States if because of this ban? What about if you're a green card holder? What if you're a green card holder on vacation when this is issued? Are you allowed to come back? You have a right of entry, don't you? You're a green card holder. So none of these things were thought through. Rudy can maybe take you through some of the examples of people stuck at the airport the first few days after this happened.
Well, I mean, I think some of the most horrific cases you heard about are refugees that have been that were coming to the United States that have been cleared. So these people have sat in limbo sometimes for years, separated from family members. I mean, the story out of Seattle was horrific, right? So basically,
but it does take for refugees to be accepted into the United States. It's a multi-year process, and there's all kinds of background checks and vetting that goes on.
I mean,
because they take such a small number in comparison to Canada, for example.
They take. I mean, I think that's actually incorrect. In terms of what they take overseas, they take a large number. They take actually the largest number, a small number of Syrians compared to what Canadians did. But in terms of overall, they take almost, I think last year's number was they were going to take something like 110,000 refugees. So it's a large program that they take, and they are the largest receiver of overseas refugees. What people have to remember is when we talk about refugees, you can usually break them up into two types. Most of the world, such as Europe, only deals with refugees that showed up their borders.
They just arrive.
They arrive, and we have to they have a right to have their story heard, and if they sort of fit the refugee definition, they're allowed to stay. The United States and Canada and about 12 other nations are involved in what's called refugee resettlement, which is if they don't have an option to remain where they are, to basically settle where they've landed, the 20 million or more refugees that are abroad, there's a small number, about over 100,000 that are resettled every year.
So these are the people that are living in camps in Turkey and Jordan. And
they
places
may be in
like
camps,
that, right?
not necessarily camps, but they're overseas and they're out of their country of origin, and they're stuck. So maybe they're sitting, for example, in Turkey, right? Mm-hmm. So and they might be Iranians that have been there for years, right? They might come from a minority group and they've lived there, and finally they're saying, well, they can't stay in Turkey. They're not going to be allowed to live in Turkey, and the UN has said, okay, we're going to help you resettle. The United States says every year we're going to take almost 100,000 of those, and basically,
that's not very well promoted.
It's not promoted at all. I think the United States gets a bad rap. Like now, they're saying, we're going to reduce that number to 50,000. The United States is still taking more resettled refugees than almost the entire program combined.
Okay,
right. So they actually do a lot of goodwill that way.
Let's pick up the story of the family coming into Seattle, and then the judge that stepped in.
Yeah. So basically, they weren't allowed to. So they arrive at the airport, and
where were they from? Do you remember?
I thought they were. If I recall correctly, I thought they were Iraqi, right?
Yeah.
So that they basically landed and they were not able to they're sitting on the other side of the border and they're told that they have to go home. And in one case, they were sent home, right? So these people are in flight. They've waited for, in some cases, years to be cleared. The United States has done all the checks. I mean, Trump's position is, we're doing this for national security. I mean, if the system was working that bad, I think the United States is in a lot of trouble. My guess is the system's been working pretty well, right? And these people they've put their names forward, they've been fingerprinted, all the data. So there's been no rush to get these people here, and all of a sudden they're turned away at the border. So horrific stories where people and then sent back and not knowing what's going to happen to them, right? I mean, you had one case where it was an Iraqi translator, a guy that had worked for the U.S. government in Iraq, right? So basically, very unpopular among some segments of the population in Iraq, the fact that he'd been working with the Americans, put his life at risk. And they'd finally said, okay, for your, for all the risk you've taken for us, we're going to resettle your family. He's on the plane and then told, no, they're going to send you back. You can't land.
So was the executive order, what's the terminology, stayed by a judge? Is that what you would say?
It was overturned.
Overturned?
And now they've applied to stay it, and the stay was denied, is my understanding, right?
Well, no, I believe that the order has been stayed pending a review of its constitutionality as an injunction, and the stay of that stay has not been agreed to be heard by the Federal Court of Appeal in one circuit, although there are other appeals, I'm told, that are percolating in the system. So
because there's one in Seattle, there's some in New York.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So, but the effect of the John Roberts order from much earlier this month was to essentially, I believe that's the judge's name, James Robert, which is a Seattle judge, was, and a Bush appointee, I should add, was to actually stop the enforcement of this order across the country.
Well, I tell you what, we'll stop it right there and we'll pick it up by what possible scenarios could come to play around the executive order signed by President Trump banning people from 7 different countries. And we're talking with Rudy Kisher and Alex Stojkovic from MKS Law in downtown Vancouver. They're immigration and citizenship lawyers, the right people to ask. And we'll pick it up next on CL 650.
There's more of the show still ahead. This is The Law Show on CL 650.